a story of a father, a hostage, and the life he never planned to save. He had one rule after leaving the Navy SEALs: never be the most dangerous person in the room again. He kept that rule for 4 years. Then a Friday morning at a downtown Chicago bank shattered everything he built. 3 armed men, a lobby full of terrified strangers, and a little girl 8 years old, clutching a stuffed rabbit, grabbed by a man with a gun before she could even scream. Elliot Mercer watched from 12 feet away, and something he buried 4 years ago woke up. If this kind of story moves you, a father, a child, and an impossible choice, subscribe to this channel and follow every part of this story to the end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere, because what happens next changes everything. The first thing Elliot Mercer did every morning was make his daughter's lunch. Not because he enjoyed it, exactly, he was a mediocre cook, and Sadie was a brutally honest critic, but because it was the one task in his day that had absolutely nothing to do with his old life. No training, no tactical assessment, no calculating angles and threats and exit routes. Just a 7-year-old with specific opinions about the peanut butter to jelly ratio, and a father trying to get it right. "You put too much jelly again," Sadie told him that Friday morning, not looking up from her cereal. "I put the right amount. Dad, the bread is wet." He looked at the sandwich. The bread was, in fact, slightly wet. "That's just freshness," he said. She gave him a look that was so much like her mother's. It knocked the air out of him for half a second. That sideways glance, flat and unimpressed, that said she knew exactly what he was doing and wasn't buying any of it. "It's wet," she repeated. "Eat your cereal." Sadie went back to her cereal. Elliot finished packing her lunch bag, the peanut butter sandwich. An apple she would definitely not eat. A small bag of crackers she absolutely would, and then stood at the kitchen window for a moment while she wasn't looking. Outside, their neighborhood was doing what it did on Friday mornings, waking up slowly. A man walked a dog down the sidewalk. 2 kids waited at the corner for a school bus that was already late. The sky over Chicago was that particular winter gray that promised nothing good, but wasn't threatening anything specific either. 4 years of this. 4 years of school lunches and parent-teacher conferences, and that particular kind of exhaustion that settles into you when you're doing everything alone. 4 years of a life so deliberately ordinary that some mornings Elliot had to remind himself that he had chosen it, that this quiet, unremarkable existence was something he had worked to build, not something that had simply happened to him. He had once known exactly who he was. Then he lost that and lost Lauren, and spent the better part of a year not knowing much of anything. What remained, after the grief finished doing what grief does, was Sadie. Sadie needed a father. Not a SEAL, not a weapon. A father who showed up, who made wet sandwiches, who sat through school plays where she played a tree and clapped anyway. So that's what he became. He worked maintenance at a commercial property management company 3 days a week, picked up Oxford security shifts at a downtown office building 2 nights a week, and on the mornings in between, he packed lunches and argued about jelly. It was not a remarkable life. It paid the bills if he was careful. It let him pick Sadie up from school himself 4 days out of 5, which was the thing that mattered most. That Friday, he needed to deposit his paycheck before noon, so the rent transfer wouldn't bounce. The bank was downtown, 8 blocks from Sadie's school, which meant he had a clean window, drop her off, take the L to Madison Street, handle the deposit, pick her up at 3:15. Simple. Ordinary, a Friday. He got to the bank at 10:47. The First Continental branch on West Madison was the kind of place that still had marble floors and a row of actual teller windows along one wall, a building that remembered when banks were supposed to feel substantial. At mid-morning on a Friday, the lobby held maybe 20 people, a young couple at a new accounts desk, an older man filling out a deposit slip at the standing counter along the wall, a few people in the teller line, a security guard near the door who was reading something on his phone and not paying attention to anything else. Elliot took a spot in line and studied his paycheck stub to make sure the numbers matched what he'd been told they would. They didn't, by $12, which meant a phone call he didn't want to make, but would have to anyway. He was still looking at the stub when the doors opened. A woman walked in, first early 30s, dark coat, the kind of controlled, deliberate walk that said she was used to moving through spaces efficiently. Behind her, a little girl in a bright red jacket tugged at the strap of her backpack, and looked around the lobby with the particular attention of a child who finds everything interesting. Elliot noticed them because he noticed everyone not out of paranoia, just habit. 4 years of deliberately ordinary life hadn't quite erased every instinct. He noticed the girl's red jacket because it was bright. He noticed the woman because she moved like someone who knew where she was going. He noticed nothing threatening about either of them, so he looked back at his pay stub. He was still looking at it when the front doors burst open again. 3 men, dark clothing, ski masks, moving fast. The first one through the door fired a single shot into the ceiling. The sound in that marble lobby was extraordinary, a concussive crack that seemed to come from everywhere at once and turned the air solid. Someone screamed. Several people dropped. The security guard at the door didn't even get his hand to his holster before the third man was on him. Weapon up, voice loud and flat. Everyone down, hands where I can see them. Do it now. Elliot was already lowering himself before the second sentence finished. Not because he was frightened, though his heart was moving faster because going down was the right move, and his body knew it before his mind finished processing what was happening. He put his hands flat on the cool marble and looked. 3 men. He cataloged them in the time it took the screaming to stop. The one at the door, the one who had taken the guard's weapon and zip-tied his wrists, was the smallest of the 3 but moved with the economy of someone who had done physical work his entire life. The one who had fired the ceiling shot was now moving along the teller windows, weapon up, voice controlled. The third, the biggest, broadest, stationed himself near the center of the lobby where he could see everyone. They weren't panicking. They weren't shouting over each other or changing their minds. They moved to positions as if they had rehearsed them, which they almost certainly had. Not amateurs. Elliot put that fact in a specific part of his mind and kept it there. He was 15 feet from the nearest exit. The service corridor door was to his left, set into the wall past the teller windows, partially obscured by a row of ATM kiosks. He noted it, without moving his eyes toward it for more than half a second. He was going to stay down. He was going to be another terrified civilian. He was going to let this play out and go home and pick up his daughter. That was the plan. Then the big man in the center of the lobby grabbed the little girl in the red jacket. She didn't scream right away. That was the thing that stuck with Elliot for a fraction of a second. The girl just went rigid, completely still, the way children sometimes do when something happens that is too large for them to process immediately. Then the sound came out of her, high and broken, and she twisted against the man's grip with the blind, furious energy of a child who has not yet learned that some things can't be fought by will alone. "Stop moving," the man said, not angry, flat, almost bored. Which was worse somehow. The girl stopped. She was breathing in short, hard gasps. Elliot watched from the floor. He kept his face down, his expression as blank and frightened as anyone else in the room. He was counting, noting. The girl was being held near the center of the lobby, between Elliot and the teller windows. The service door was approximately 40 feet from her position. He was going to stay down. He was going to be a civilian. Outside the glass front of the bank, something moved. Elliot shifted his gaze without lifting his head. The woman in the dark coat, the one who had come in just before the gunman was outside on the sidewalk, pressed against the pillar beside the entrance. She must have been close enough to the door when it happened that she'd gotten out before they sealed the lobby. Now she stood there, coat open, one hand pressed over her mouth, eyes locked on the little girl through the glass. Her face was doing something Elliot recognized. He had seen that exact expression before, in different places, under different conditions, on the faces of people who were watching something happen to someone they loved and couldn't stop it. The woman outside was the girl's mother. Elliot looked back at the child. She was still gripping the stuffed rabbit she'd been carrying when she walked in. She hadn't let go of it. Her knuckles were white around its worn ear, and she was staring at the floor the way people do when they are trying to make themselves very small inside their own heads. He thought about Sadie. He told himself not to think about Sadie. He thought about Sadie anyway. The next several minutes were careful, controlled chaos. The gunman herded the hostages toward the back wall of the lobby, 12 people total, now that Elliot counted properly. The security guard was seated against the door with his wrists bound. The tellers had been pulled from behind their windows and added to the group. The young couple from the new accounts desk were holding each other's hands so tightly both their fingers had gone white. The big man kept hold of the girl. Elliot positioned himself at the end of the hostage group, close to the ATM kiosks, which put the service door about 22 feet to his left. He sat with his back against the wall and kept his breathing even and watched. The man who seemed to be in charge, the one who'd fired the ceiling shot, whose voice carried the particular authority of someone who expected to be obeyed, and usually was moved between the teller windows and the center of the lobby. He hadn't touched the cash drawers. That was interesting. 20 minutes into a bank robbery, you touch the cash drawers. You start moving money. You start creating pressure. He hadn't done any of that. He was doing something else. Elliot wasn't sure yet what it was. The girl, the man with the rabbit, hadn't told her to put it down, which might have been oversight, or might have been a kind of practical calculation that a crying child was less useful than a quiet one, had stopped making noise. She sat cross-legged on the floor near the big man's feet, with the rabbit pressed against her chest, and her eyes moving around the room in slow, careful circuits. She was scared. She was also, Elliot noticed, watching, taking things in, trying to understand the shape of the situation around her. Smart kid. He waited until the big man's attention moved to the front windows, some movement outside, probably the first police units arriving, and then he shifted his position slightly, just enough to bring himself 3 feet closer to the girl. Nobody looked at him. When she completed her next circuit of the room, her eyes landed on him. He didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't do anything that might draw attention. He simply held her gaze for a moment and gave the smallest, slowest nod he could, the kind that said, "I see you. I'm here, you're okay." She stared at him for 2 full seconds. Then she gave the tiniest nod back. "You," said a voice. Elliot looked up. The leader was standing 6 feet away, looking at him with an attention that was specific and focused, and not good. He had the weapon at his side, not pointed at anything, but his eyes had the flat, measuring quality of someone doing arithmetic. "What's your name?" "Elliot." "What do you do, Elliot?" "Building maintenance." The man studied him for a moment. "Then you're not scared." "I'm scared," Elliot said. "Your hands aren't shaking." Elliot looked at his hands. They weren't shaking. He'd controlled that years ago, back when shaking hands cost you things you couldn't afford to lose. "They stopped," he said. "Some people go cold when they're scared. I go cold." It was close enough to the truth that it came out easily. The man kept looking at him. Military? A half-second pause. Just enough to seem like a reluctant admission rather than a rehearsed one. "Once, a long time ago. What branch? Navy? Special ops?" Elliot met his eyes. That life's over. Something passed across the man's face, not quite suspicion, not quite satisfaction. He held Elliot's gaze for another moment, then moved on. But he positioned himself slightly differently afterward, and Elliot noticed that the big man in the center of the room angled his body to keep Elliot in his peripheral vision. They'd noted him. That was a problem. It was also possibly an opportunity. It was the leader's phone call that gave Elliot the rest of what he needed. 40 minutes in, the man stepped toward the far corner of the lobby and spoke in a low voice to someone on the other end of a call. Low, but the marble carried sound in ways the man didn't seem to have accounted for, and Elliot was now close enough, and still enough, and practiced enough at listening without appearing to listen. He caught pieces, then more than pieces. "She's not coming in." A pause. "She's outside. We need to change the approach." Another pause. "The girl isn't the point. The girl is the door." Elliot kept his face completely still. He went back through what he'd seen. The woman in the dark coat, outside, pressed against the pillar. The gunman who hadn't touched the cash drawers. The way they'd grabbed the little girl immediately, before doing anything else, almost as if that had been the first task, not an opportunistic decision. The girl isn't the point. The girl is the door. They had come here for the woman outside. The woman who was the girl's mother. The bank robbery was a frame, something to create a sealed, controlled environment with police outside, who would assume they understood the situation. The plan was to use the girl to bring the mother inside and then take them both. He didn't know why. He didn't know who the woman was or what she had, that someone wanted badly enough to arrange this. What he knew was this: at some point in the next few minutes, they were going to make their move on the mother, and once that happened, the situation would change shape entirely. More hostages meant more variables. More variables meant worse odds for everyone. And once they moved the girl, once they had what they needed, and this lobby was no longer useful to them, the people sitting against this back wall would become liability instead of leverage. Elliot had done enough of this in enough places to know what happened to liabilities. He had spent 4 years telling himself that man was gone. That the training and the calculations and the ruthless, unsentimental assessment of every room he walked into, that all of that belonged to someone he used to be. Sitting on a marble floor with his back against a wall and a child 12 feet away, who was going to be moved in the next few minutes, he understood something he hadn't expected to understand. The man wasn't gone. He had just been waiting for a reason. He looked at the service door. He looked at the girl. He looked at the positions of 3 armed men who had not quite accounted for what was sitting against their back wall. He began to calculate. Outside through the glass, he could see the woman in the dark coat, still standing at the pillar, still watching, still unable to move. Her eyes had been on her daughter for the entire 40 minutes. She hadn't looked away once. Whatever she was, whatever she had, that someone wanted enough to do this right now. She was just a mother watching her child across a pane of glass and not being able to get to her. Elliot understood that feeling completely. He made his decision. The decision didn't feel like a decision. That was the thing about moments like this, and Elliot had lived through enough of them to know they didn't arrive with weight and ceremony. They arrived the way a door swings open, quietly, without announcing themselves, and suddenly you were on the other side before you'd fully processed that you'd moved. He had made his choice. Now came the part that was harder, waiting. Waiting was a skill. People didn't understand that. They thought action was the difficult part, the moment of movement, the point where everything compressed into a single physical decision. But waiting was where most people fell apart. Waiting required you to sit inside your own fear without letting it change your face, your breathing, your posture. It required you to watch without looking like you were watching, to think without looking like you were thinking, and to stay completely, utterly still while every instinct in your body pushed toward something. Elliot was good at waiting. He had been good at it since long before the Navy taught him to be better. He settled back against the wall and let his shoulders drop another half-inch visible relaxation, the kind that said just another frightened man trying to get through this, and behind that performance, he ran through everything he had. 3 men. The leader mid-40s, medium build, the one who'd spoken to him, and whose voice on the phone had been controlled but tight around the edges. The tightness of someone whose plan had already encountered its first complication. The big man in the center, younger, possibly late 20s, the one holding the girl, built like someone who'd spent years in physical labor rather than a gym, which meant real strength rather than performance strength. The third man, the one by the door, smallest of the 3, who had taken the guard's weapon and was now stationed near the entrance with his back to the glass, and his attention moving between the hostages and the street. 12 hostages against the back wall. The security guard by the door, wrists bound, sitting with his head down in the way of someone who had already accepted that this situation was beyond him. The girl Piper, he would learn her name later, cross-legged on the floor near the big man's feet, still gripping her rabbit, her eyes still moving in those careful circuits. The service door 22 feet to Elliot's left. He'd clocked it 20 minutes ago and hadn't looked at it directly since. He didn't need to. He had the geometry of the room in his head the way he'd had the geometry of dozens of rooms and dozens of places he was not going to think about right now. 22 feet of open floor between him and the door. The door opened inward. He'd confirmed that from the faint gap at the bottom hinge side when the teller had gone through it earlier, under instruction from the leader. Beyond the door, a service corridor that he estimated ran along the back of the building toward a rear exit. Standard bank construction. He had a reasonable probability of being right about that, not a certainty. Reasonable probabilities were what you had. Certainties were for people who'd never done this. The problem was the big man's position. The girl was 12 feet from the service door, and the big man was 2 feet from the girl, and the big man's peripheral vision covered the entire space between the hostage wall and the teller windows. Moving toward the door meant moving through that field. Not impossible, but not clean. He needed a distraction. Something loud, something that would take all 3 sets of eyes for at least half a second, not long. He wasn't asking for long. Half a second was all and give him the opening to cross the floor. He began to look, slowly, at the objects within reach without moving his hands. The girl completed another circuit of the room, and her eyes landed on him again. She'd been doing this every few minutes, working her way around the lobby in slow, careful sweeps and coming back to him each time. He didn't fully understand why he'd become her anchor in the room. Maybe because he was the only one who'd acknowledged her. Maybe because he was the only one who didn't look like he was falling apart. This time when she found his face, he held her gaze a beat longer than before. Then, very slowly, very carefully, he tilted his chin slightly toward the service door. Not a gesture anyone standing would notice, just a fraction of movement, a direction, a suggestion. Her eyes moved to the door, stayed there for 2 seconds, came back to him. He gave her the same slow nod as before. She looked at him with an expression that was too old for her face, a measuring look, the kind of look that asked a question without asking it out loud. He understood the question. It was the same question anyone in her position would be asking. Are you someone I can trust? Or are you just another unpredictable element in a room full of them? He kept his face still and his eyes steady and let her make the call. She gave him the smallest nod he had ever seen, a compression of the chin, 0.5 millimeter maybe, but deliberate. Something in his chest loosened slightly. 20 more minutes passed, then 30. Outside, the police presence had thickened. Elliot could see it in the way the leader kept moving to the front of the lobby to look through the glass, a tactical assessment becoming less confident, the kind of recalculation that happened when a plan's timeline started slipping. He'd heard the man make 2 more calls, both short, both guarded, and he had the sense that whatever mechanisms was supposed to bring the woman inside hadn't worked. She was still out there. Elliot could see her occasionally through the glass when the leader moved away from that part of the lobby, still at the pillar, still watching. The police had set up a perimeter that had pushed most of the civilian bystanders back, but she was still there, which told him either the police didn't know who she was or she'd refused to move. He guessed the latter. The girl's name, he found out, was Piper. He learned it when the leader walked past her and crouched down not gently at all, but with the flat impatience of a man adjusting a tool that wasn't performing as expected, and said, low and without warmth, "Piper, I need you to be still and quiet for a little while longer." She looked up at him. "My mom's outside, I know. She can see me through the window. I know that too. Are you going to make her come in?" The man didn't answer. He stood back up and walked away. Piper watched him go. Then she looked back at Elliot, and the expression on her face this time was different, older again. And worse, because it wasn't fear anymore. It was understanding. Children were not stupid. And this one in particular seemed to have figured out something that most of the adults in the room were still catching up to. The bank robbery wasn't the point. She was the point. Her mother was the point. And she had understood this in the time it took the leader to not answer her question. Elliot watched her process it, watched her hold the rabbit tighter, watched her to decide, and he could see the decision happen, could track it across her face not to fall apart. 8 years old. He thought about what he would want Sadie to do in this room, and the thought made his jaw tighten, and he put it away. Carefully, over the next 5 minutes, he shifted his position by degrees. Small movements, timed to moments when the big man's attention was elsewhere, when a phone rang, when one of the other hostages coughed, when a police siren outside briefly pulled everyone's gaze toward the windows. Each shift was 6 inches, maybe 8. Each one changed his geometry relative to the service door. He was now 18 feet from it. He had identified his distraction. A metal crowd control stanchion, the kind banks used to organize teller lines, had been knocked over during the initial rush and come to rest against the base of the nearest ATM kiosk, approximately 4 feet to his right. It was lying flat, not balanced. But if he could shift it with his foot, get it upright, even partially, and then let it fall, the crash would be significant in this marble room. He needed the big man looking away from the girl for half a second. Just half a second. He was going over it for the 4th time: distance, angle, the girl's reaction, the big man's anticipated response, the leader's likely position when the girl spoke. She didn't speak to the big man. She didn't speak to the leader. She turned her head with the careful casualness of a child, trying to look like she wasn't doing something deliberate. She looked at Elliot, and she said quietly enough that only he could hear, "Are you going to do something?" The big man was 6 feet away and facing the front windows. Elliot kept his expression completely unchanged. His voice came out barely above a breath. Working on it. She looked at him for a second. Okay, she said. I won't scream. He hadn't asked her not to scream. She had anticipated the instruction he hadn't given yet, which meant she had been thinking through the logistics herself. 8 years old. Good, he said at the same volume. When I move, you move. Don't wait for me to tell you again. Just go through that door on the left and run. She didn't look at the door this time. She'd already memorized where it was. What if it's locked? It's not. He had watched 2 different employees use it without a keycard. The exterior handle was plain, unlocked from the inside. Okay, a pause. What's your name? Elliot, I'm Piper. I know. She thought about this for a moment. My mom's going to want to thank you. He almost said let's get there first, but didn't. Focus on the door. She gave him that half-millimeter nod again and looked back at the floor. 6 feet away, the big man shifted his weight and turned back toward the lobby. His eyes moved across the hostages, a sweep, methodical checking positions. Elliot was sitting in the same place he'd been sitting for the past 40 minutes. Nothing had changed visibly. The big man's gaze moved on. The leader's phone rang. Not the soft vibration of a phone set to silent an actual ring, which meant whoever was calling was not part of their team, or the call was coming through a different channel. The leader answered it quickly, moved to the far corner, and his voice dropped to the kind of murmur that required concentration to maintain, which meant his attention would be divided for the next 30 seconds. The third man at the door had his back mostly toward the lobby. His attention was on the police vehicles he could see through the glass. The big man was looking at the front of the lobby. Elliot had his window. His right foot moved to the base of the stanchion. He was not calm. He wanted to be clear about that. Even to himself, there was no Zen stillness, no warrior's serenity, none of the things people imagined when they thought about men who had done this kind of work. His heart was hitting his sternum hard enough that he could feel it in his back teeth. His left hand was pressed flat against the floor, and his fingers were cold. He was 37 years old, and he had a daughter to pick up at 3:15, and he was scared in the specific, focused way of a man who knows exactly what is about to happen and exactly how many things can go wrong. He kicked the stanchion. The sound it made when it hit the marble floor of that lobby was tremendous. Not just loud, tremendous. A crashing, clanging, reverberating explosion of noise that hit the walls and came back and hit them again, and in the half-second that followed, every head in the room turned toward it, which was exactly what Elliot had known would happen, because loud, sudden, unexpected sounds were one of the few reliable universals. He was already moving before the sound finished. 18 feet was not far. It was also not close, not with armed men in the room, not when his leg had a knot in the left knee that still gave him trouble on cold mornings, not when the floor was polished marble and his work boots weren't made for speed. He crossed it in what felt like a very long time and was probably just over 2 seconds, keeping low, using the ATM kiosks as cover for the first half of the distance. Piper was moving. He hadn't seen her start, he'd been committed to his own path, but she was moving when he reached her position, already on her feet, already turning toward the door, the rabbit clamped under one arm. She moved fast. Kids moved fast when they were scared and committed, and someone they'd decided to trust had told them which door to go through. Elliot got between her and the big man. He didn't have a plan beyond this point in the same way you have a plan. He had training, which was different. Training was what your body did when your mind was too busy to give instructions. The big man had turned. He was faster than he looked, which was usually the case with men that size, and he had his weapon coming up as he registered what was happening, and his mouth was opening to shout, and Elliot's left hand was already moving toward the weapon's trajectory. "Hey," Elliot said, which was not a tactical phrase. But it made the man's eyes go to his face for a fraction of a second, and that fraction was what he needed. He redirected the weapon's line with his left forearm, not grabbing it, not wrestling for it, just changing its direction the way you'd redirect a river, using momentum and angle, and his right hand went to the man's wrist, and he used the man's own mass against him, turning the larger body away from the direction Piper had gone. The weapon discharged. The shot went into the ceiling. A second shot from somewhere plaster dust, and the smell of gunpowder and someone screaming, and Elliot had the big man off balance, which was all he needed, because off balance meant one more moment, and one more moment was enough. He drove the man into the ATM kiosk with enough force to end the immediate struggle, and then the lobby was full of the particular controlled chaos that happened when tactical units came through doors, which they were doing through the front, through the service corridor, through a side entrance Elliot hadn't identified because he hadn't needed it, and voices were shouting the specific words that meant the situation had changed hands. He pressed himself against the nearest pillar and put his hands visible and high. Piper was through the service door. The next 20 minutes were loud and confusing in the way that all situations like this eventually became loud and confusing, regardless of how controlled the approach. People were crying. 2 of the hostages had gone down during the tactical entry, not hit, just overwhelmed, both conscious and uninjured, but on the floor and not making sense. The security guard was being attended to. The 3 gunmen were in various states of physical restraint. The leader had made a run for the service corridor and had been taken there by officers who'd entered from the rear. Elliot heard this from the officer crouching beside him, who was going through the routine of establishing who he was and whether he was hurt. "I'm fine," Elliot said. "Sir, you've got blood on your—" "It's not mine." He wasn't sure if that was entirely true. His left forearm was aching in a way that suggested the weapon's frame had connected with it during the redirect. But he could move it, and nothing was grinding, and it wasn't important right now. The little girl. "Did she get out, Sir Piper?" "The girl in the red jacket. Did she get out?" The officer spoke into his radio. Waited. "Then she's outside. She's with her mother." Something in Elliot's chest unclenched. He leaned his head back against the marble pillar and looked at the ceiling. There was a hole in it where the big man's weapon had discharged, and plaster dust was still settling in a fine white layer across the floor, and the light through the front windows was the flat winter gray it had been when he'd arrived here. Though it felt like it should be a different season by now. 3:15, he thought. He still had to pick up Sadie. The detective's name was Hargrove, and she had the specific kind of weariness that belonged to people who had spent years in rooms like this, in the aftermath of situations like this, asking questions that most people didn't want to answer. "You want to tell me how a building maintenance worker took down a man that size?" she asked. She had a notepad, but wasn't writing in it. She was just looking at him. "Adrenaline," Elliot said. "Uh-huh," and he was off balance. "Mr. Mercer." She set down the notepad entirely. "We ran your name 15 minutes ago. You want to try again?" He looked at his hands for a moment. Both of them turned palm up on the table in the small room they'd moved him to for questioning. His left forearm had been wrapped by a paramedic, nothing broken, badly bruised, the kind of thing that was going to be spectacular colors by morning. "Navy," he said. "SEAL teams. I got out 8 years ago." 8 years is a long time to not forget how to do what you just did in there. "You don't forget," he said. "You just stop using it." Hargrove looked at him steadily. "You want to tell me why you stopped?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside the door, he could hear the activity of the aftermath voices, movement, the bureaucratic machinery of an incident response. "My wife died," he said. "I have a daughter. She needed a father more than she needed someone who was away most of the year running operations he couldn't talk about." He paused. "So I left, and I built something different. And today?" He met her eyes. "Today I was in the wrong bank at the wrong time." Hargrove picked her notepad back up, looked at something she'd written earlier. "These 3 men," she said, "in your assessment, based on what you observed inside amateurs or professional." Professional. Not military, but professional. They'd rehearsed entry positions. They moved to specific points without discussion. The leader's communications suggested an external coordinator. He hesitated for a second, then decided she needed to know all of it. Detective. They weren't robbing the bank. She looked up. The cash drawers were never touched. The woman outside Piper's mother, they wanted her inside. The girl was the mechanism. The stated goal was to abduct both of them together. He watched her face process this. Which means somebody hired these 3 men. Somebody with money and enough operational knowledge to plan a multi-person abduction using a bank robbery as cover. That's not a grudge, that's a contract. The room was very quiet for a moment. "These 3 men," Hargrove said, "are not the top of this." "No," Elliot said, "they're not." She wrote something. Looked at it. Looked back at him. "You're going to be here for a while." "I have to pick up my daughter at 3:15. Hargrove stared at him for a long moment, with the expression of someone who had not expected that sentence in this conversation. Then she pulled out her phone. "Give me the school. I'll have an officer pick her up and bring her here." He felt something in him resist this, the instinct of a man who had spent 4 years managing every piece of his daughter's life himself, who did not hand off things that mattered. But the math was simple. He couldn't be in 2 places, and this room wasn't optional yet. "Westside Elementary," he said. "She's 7. Her name's Sadie. She has a blue backpack with a yellow star on it, and she won't go with a stranger. So tell whoever you send to say that her dad said she could have the big bag of crackers for dinner." Hargrove blinked. The crackers. She'll understand. Outside the bank, through a window in the door at the end of the hallway, Elliot could see the organized activity of the police perimeter. Ambulances, tactical vehicles, the careful procedural business of an incident being processed and documented and handed over to the appropriate mechanisms. And near one of the ambulances, visible for a moment before a group of officers moved and blocked his line of sight, he saw a woman in a dark coat crouched down on the sidewalk with her arms around a little girl in a red jacket, the rabbit still wedged between them. He watched for the 2 seconds. He could see them. Then they were gone behind the activity. He thought about Piper's voice, barely above a whisper, when she'd asked him if he was going to do something. The matter-of-fact quality of it. The small, precise nod she'd given him when he confirmed it. The way she'd been on her feet and moving before he'd even cleared the first half of the distance to the big man. He had told her, "When I move, you move." She had done exactly that. No hesitation. No extra questions. She'd made her decision and she'd committed to it completely, which was more than he could say for most adults he'd worked with in his old life. 8 years old. He sat back against the wall in the hallway and waited for Hargrove to come back, and tried not to think about the fact that the 3 men who had just been arrested were not the people responsible for what had happened inside that lobby today. Someone had planned this. Someone careful and resourceful and angry enough to fund an operation like this had watched a woman and a little girl and decided they were leverage. That someone was still out there. And they had gotten nothing today. Which meant they were not finished. Elliot understood this with the same certainty. He had understood the geometry of the room, the position of the service door, the trajectory of the weapon when the big man brought it up. Not a guess. Not a fear. A calculation. He thought about the woman in the dark coat. He thought about Piper's rabbit. He thought about the particular expression on the leader's face when his plan had started slipping, not panic, but the recalibrating focus of someone who was adjusting rather than abandoning. He sat in the hallway and waited, and the afternoon light through the window went from flat gray to the slightly darker gray that meant the day was moving on. And somewhere across the city, his daughter was in a classroom, probably wondering where he was. And he was in this hallway understanding that the thing he had walked into this morning was not finished. It had barely started. Hargrove came back 40 minutes later with a paper cup of coffee that she set in front of him without asking if he wanted it, which he appreciated. She also told him that Sadie had been collected from school by a female officer named Chen, that Sadie had listened carefully to the message about the crackers, looked Officer Chen up and down with the specific skepticism of a child who took security seriously, and then announced that she would require both the large crackers and a juice box before she went anywhere. "She sounds like a handful," Hargrove said. "She's 7, Elliot said. "She's exactly what she should be." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. It was bad coffee, the kind that had been sitting in a station house pot since early morning, but it was hot, and he hadn't eaten since 6 a. And his body was doing the thing it did after high-stress situations, the slow metabolic reckoning that left him hollow and slightly shaky if he didn't put something in him. He drank the coffee. Hargrove sat across from him with her notepad and went through it properly this time, the full sequence, from the moment he'd entered the bank to the moment the tactical units had come through the doors. He told her everything accurately and in order, because there was no reason not to. He omitted nothing except the specific calculations he'd run while waiting, which weren't relevant to her report and which he didn't particularly want on record. When he finished, she looked at her notes for a moment. Then the phone call you overheard. The leader said the girl was a door, not the point. Those were the words. The girl isn't the point. The girl is the door. And your read on the woman outside. I don't know who she is, Elliot said. But whoever she is, Someone spent real money and real time building an operation around taking her. That's not personal. That's business. Hargrove made a note. Her name is Vivian Alden. She's the CEO of Alden Capital Group. You may have seen the name. She closed a major acquisition about 8 months ago that pushed a competitor into restructuring. Made the business press. He hadn't seen it. He didn't read the business press. And the competitor? Hargrove looked at him steadily. That's the part we're working on. He understood that to mean, that's the part I'm not telling you yet. He didn't push it. It wasn't his investigation, and he was already further into this than a building maintenance worker had any business being. He nodded and finished his coffee and asked again when he could see his daughter. Soon Hargrove said, and then after a pause, Mr. Mercer, what you did in there, what you actually did, mechanically, physically you understand that most people couldn't have done that. Most people haven't spent 5 years learning how. You said 8 years since you got out. 5 years before I got out learning how, he said. Then the time after. You don't unlearn it, you just stop using it. You said that before. It's still true. She considered this. The girl asked one of the EMTs about you. She wanted to know if Elliot was okay. The EMT didn't know your name, so she described you. The girl said you told her that moving to the door when you moved was the right thing, and that she'd done it correctly. Hargrove paused. She's 8. I know how old she is. She handled herself better than most adults I've seen in those situations. She made a decision, and she committed to it, Elliot said. That's all it ever is. Most people don't commit. They freeze up at the moment of commitment. He looked at the table. She didn't freeze. Hargrove wrote something. Her mother would like to speak with you. The sentence landed with a particular weight that Elliot recognized as significant, though he couldn't have articulated exactly why. He was aware in a vague but concrete way that the woman in the dark coat, Vivian Alden, CEO, person that someone had spent real money attempting to abduct, was not a category of person that generally intersected with his life in any meaningful way. And he was also aware, equally concretely, that he was tired and his arm hurt, and he smelled like a bank that had been subjected to 2 discharged weapons and tactical entry, and that the primary thing he wanted was to see his daughter. Later, he said. Right now I need to see Sadie. Sadie was in a room down the hall with Officer Chen, who had procured both the large crackers and a juice box from somewhere, and who looked mildly relieved when Elliot appeared in the doorway. Sadie looked up from the crackers and looked at him with the same flat, measuring assessment she'd used on the sandwich that morning, running it over his face and his arm, and the general condition of him. And then she got up and walked over and put her arms around his waist and pressed her face against his chest and didn't say anything for a while. He put his hand on the back of her head and didn't say anything either. After a moment, she said, muffled against his shirt, Officer Chen said there was an incident. There was. She said you were helpful. I tried to be. Sadie pulled back and looked up at him, and the expression on her face was something he didn't have a clean word for. Not quite fear, not quite relief, not quite the particular anger of a child who had been frightened on behalf of someone they loved. A combination of all of them, maybe, pressing against each other behind her eyes. Your arm, she said. It's wrapped up. It's fine. It doesn't look fine, Sadie. I'm just saying it doesn't look fine. She looked at his arm for another second, then back at his face. Are we going home? Yeah, we're going home. Can we get actual food? Not the wet sandwich. He almost laughed. Not quite, but almost, yeah, he said. We can get actual food. He took her to the diner 2 blocks from their apartment, a place they went on Friday evenings when his paycheck had cleared, and neither of them wanted to deal with cooking, which was most Fridays. It was the kind of diner that had been in the same location since before either of them existed, run by a family whose name was on a plaque by the door, and whose coffee was reliably good, and whose pancakes Sadie held in a reverence she extended a few other things. She ordered pancakes. He ordered whatever the special was without reading it. They sat in the booth by the window, and the Friday evening street outside moved past them in the normal way of Friday evening streets. And for a little while, Elliot let himself just exist in that normality without pushing through it toward anything else. Sadie ate her pancakes with focused attention. She was a serious eater. She didn't do other things while she ate. As a rule, no talking, no looking around, just the business of the meal. He had always found this quality both amusing and oddly reassuring. It was a quality that suggested a person who understood priorities. Halfway through the pancakes, she set down her fork and said, "Did you have to do old stuff today?" He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Old stuff. From before." She picked up her fork again, looked at it, set it down again. "You don't talk about before. But I know there was a before. Grandma told me some things, and you never told me not to ask." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a couple walked past the window arguing about something neither of them seemed to feel strongly about, the kind of low-level domestic friction that was almost companionable. "Yeah," he said, "I had to do some old stuff today. Because someone needed help. Because a little girl needed help. And I was in the right place. Sadie thought about this. Or the wrong place. Depends on how you look at it." She picked up her fork, ate a piece of pancake, chewed it, set the fork down again. "Are you okay?" The question was simple. The question was the kind of thing that would have been easy to deflect with a yes and a change of subject, and she probably would have accepted it because she was 7 and she didn't yet have all the vocabulary for the conversation she was trying to have. But she was also looking at him with those eyes that were so much like Lauren's that it still occasionally stopped him cold, and she had asked the question with the directness of someone who wanted an actual answer. "I'm working on it," he said. She seemed to consider whether this was acceptable. Then she nodded once and went back to her pancakes. They finished dinner. He paid. They walked home through the Chicago cold, Sadie's hand in his, and she talked about something that had happened at school that he only partially followed but made sounds of engagement at appropriate intervals. And by the time they reached their building, the evening had done what evenings sometimes manage to do, settled things somewhat. Not resolved them, just settled them. He got her to bed and sat in the kitchen for a long time with a glass of water he didn't drink, thinking about what Hargrove had told him. Vivian Alden, Alden Capital Group. A competitor pushed into restructuring 8 months ago. He thought about the leader's voice on the phone, the precise, practiced quality of the operation. The fact that the cash drawers had never been touched. Someone with money, someone with access to the kind of people who could plan an operation like this and execute it with that level of precision. Someone who had been watching Vivian Alden and her daughter long enough to know their patterns, know which bank they used, know what time on a Friday Vivian Alden made a specific deposit that Piper sometimes accompanied her on. Not anger, not impulsive, patient, resourced, organized. He went to bed at midnight and lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling for a while. And then, because there was nothing useful he could do about it tonight, he closed his eyes and made himself sleep. Vivian Alden called him the next morning at 8:47. He didn't recognize the number, but he answered it, because he always answered numbers he didn't recognize, an old habit from a life where unknown numbers sometimes mattered. Mr. Mercer. Her voice was not what he'd expected, though he couldn't have said precisely what he'd expected. It was controlled, measured, the voice of someone who had spent years in rooms full of people who were watching for weakness and had learned to give them as little to work with as possible. But underneath the control, there was something that hadn't been filtered out completely, a roughness, the kind that came from a night of not enough sleep and too many difficult things to process. "This is Vivian Alden. I hope it's all right that I—" "It's fine," he said. "How's Piper?" A pause. The pause of someone who had been prepared to say several things and had not been prepared for that question first. She had a hard night. She slept eventually. She's asking questions I don't entirely know how to answer. That sounds about right. Mr. Mercer, I'd like to meet with you. At your convenience. I understand you have a daughter of your own and a work schedule to consider, so I'm happy to work around whatever. Ms. Alden, he kept his voice level. I don't need anything from you. I was in the bank. I did what made sense. You don't owe me anything. Another pause, shorter this time. I'm aware I don't owe you anything, Mr. Mercer. I'd still like to meet. He looked at the kitchen window. The Saturday morning street outside was quiet. Sadie was still asleep, which was a minor Friday night miracle. Why? Because I have questions that Detective Hargrove can't answer. And I think you can. A beat. And because Piper asked me this morning if she could write you a letter, and I told her I'd find out if that was all right. He was quiet for a moment. It's all right, he said. Where do you want to meet? She had suggested her office, and he had said somewhere neutral, and they had settled on a coffee shop 3 blocks from the bank, which seemed like an odd choice in retrospect, but was the first specific location either of them had named, and neither had wanted to spend more time negotiating it. He wore the same clothes he wore to work: dark jeans, a gray thermal, his coat. His arm was still wrapped, and he'd taken something for the pain, which had taken the edge off without eliminating it. He arrived 7 minutes early, which was a habit, and sat with his back to the wall, which was also a habit, and ordered coffee, which was necessity. Vivian Alden arrived exactly on time. In the bank, through the glass, he'd registered her as dark coat, controlled movement, expression of a person watching something unbearable. In person, in daylight, she was different in the specific ways that people were always different from the impressions formed under duress. She was taller than he'd estimated. Her face had the composed quality he'd heard in her voice on the phone, the professional mask, but there were seams in it, faint shadows under her eyes, a tightness around her jaw that said the night had been as bad as he'd guessed. She sat across from him, looked at him directly. "Thank you for meeting me." "You said Piper had questions," he said. "What questions?" She blinked. He had done it again, skipped the expected social prelude and gone straight to the thing he wanted to know. He wasn't trying to be rude. He was genuinely asking. But he watched her recalibrate and felt mildly guilty about it. "She wants to know how you knew what to do," Vivian said. She said, "You seemed like you'd done it before." She's perceptive. She is. Something moved across Vivian's face when she said it, not quite pride, not quite grief, something in between. The expression of a parent looking at a quality in their child that they love and also find frightening because of what it means the child has already had to use it on. "She also wants to know if you were scared." "Yes." "She asked me to ask you specifically whether you were scared." "Yes," he said again, "I was scared." Vivian studied him. "But you did it anyway. That's what scared means. It doesn't mean you stop. It means you're paying attention." He paused. "You can tell her that." She nodded slowly, looked at the table for a moment. When she looked back up, the composure had adjusted again, shifted slightly towards something more direct. "Mr. Mercer, Detective Hargrove told me your background. Former SEAL. 8 years out, she told me she'd verified it. You've been working maintenance." He didn't respond to that. It wasn't a question. "She also told me what you said about the 3 men not being the top of the operation. That someone hired them." She set her hands flat on the table. They were steady, which told him either she was genuinely composed or she had very good control. "I have a security team, 11 people led by a director named Graham Vale. They had no idea this was coming. No intelligence, no warning, nothing." "That's a problem," Elliot said. "Yes, it is." She held his gaze. "I want to hire you." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his coffee. "Not to replace Graham," she said quickly, which told him she'd thought about how this conversation might go and prepared for this specific objection. "He's good at what he does. What he does is static protection, known threats, known protocols. What happened yesterday was none of those things, and his team isn't built for it." She paused. "You identified 3 specific security failures inside the bank in approximately 40 minutes while also managing an active hostage situation. I need someone who can look at everything we have and find what we're missing." "I build maintenance," Elliot said. "I'm not a security consultant." "You were a SEAL 8 years ago. You tackled a man twice your size yesterday and redirected a loaded weapon." Her voice stayed even. "The 8 years haven't taken that out of you, Mr. Mercer. We both know that." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the coffee shop window, Chicago was doing its Saturday thing: people with dogs, people with strollers, a man selling something from a cart on the corner. Ordinary, unremarkable, the city he had chosen, precisely because it was big enough that nobody paid attention to anybody. 3 weeks, she said. "That's all I'm asking. 3 weeks, you come in as a security assessment consultant. You look at everything: the team, the protocols, the building, my schedule, Piper's schedule. You tell me what's wrong and how to fix it." She named a number. He didn't react to the number, though it was significantly more than 3 weeks of maintenance work and 2 overnight security shifts combined. "And if I find things that Graham Vale doesn't want me to find?" he asked. "Then you find them anyway, and we deal with it." He looked at her. She looked back at him. She wasn't asking for reassurance, and she wasn't offering any. She was just presenting the situation with the directness of someone who was used to making decisions based on accurate information, rather than comfortable information. I have a daughter, he said. I know. My schedule isn't flexible around her. I have a daughter too, Vivian said. I understand what that means. He turned his coffee cup, turned it back. He thought about what Hargrove had said, and what he'd thought about in his kitchen at midnight, and the calculation he'd run about the kind of person who organized an operation like the one that had happened yesterday. Patient, resourced, not finished. I'll need full access, he said. Every protocol document, every schedule, every incident report your team has ever filed. Everything. You'll have it. And I talked to Graham Vale directly. Today, if possible. She pulled out her phone. I'll call him now. Ms. Alden. She looked up. If I find that whoever hired those 3 men is still active, still positioned to try something, I'm going to tell you that. Even if it's not what you want to hear. She held his gaze. That's exactly what I want to hear. He nodded. 3 weeks, he said. Graham Vale was not happy to see him. This was not surprising. What would have been surprising was a security director who was delighted to have an outside consultant brought in to review his operation 2 days after a major incident on his watch. Graham Vale was a large man with the squared-off, deliberate presence of former law enforcement Chicago PD, Elliot guessed correctly, later confirmed, and he had the controlled expression of someone who was professionally obligated to cooperate and personally opposed to it. They met in the security office on the 14th floor of Alden Capital Group's downtown building that Saturday afternoon. The space was clean, organized, all glass and controlled sight lines, and it told Elliot several things about Graham's methodology before the man had said a word. A system built for visibility and structure, designed hands around the assumption that threats would present themselves through known channels. Mr. Mercer, Graham said. He didn't extend his hand. Mr. Vale, Elliot didn't either. No performance of warmth that wasn't there. I appreciate you making time on a Saturday. Miss Alden asked me to, Graham said, which was not quite the same thing as being appreciated. He gestured to a chair across from his desk and sat down. I've been told you want access to our operational files. All of them. Yes. Graham's jaw moved slightly. Can I ask what specifically you're looking for? I don't know yet. That's why I need all of them. The jaw movement again. What happened at the bank we had no intelligence suggesting. I know, Elliot said. That's not a criticism. Absence of intelligence isn't the same as failure. The failure is in not knowing why the intelligence was absent. He paused. Your team's good at protecting against things you know about. Someone planned something you didn't know about. The question is why you didn't know, and whether there's a reason you still don't. Graham looked at him for a long moment, the look of a man doing the same calculation Elliot had done with the hostile professionals in his old life, deciding whether the person across from him was an enemy or just an inconvenience. You're saying they'd been watching her for a while. An operation like that doesn't get built in a week. The bank, the timing, the 3 men, the coordination, that's months of planning. Maybe more. Elliot held his gaze, which means someone was watching your principal and her daughter long enough to know their Friday pattern. That's not a gap in intelligence. That's a gap in counter-surveillance. Graham was very still for a moment. You don't have counter-surveillance, Elliot said. It wasn't a question. We have standard close protection protocols. Close protection watches for threats in front of your principal. Counter-surveillance watches for people watching your principal. Those are not the same thing. He said it without satisfaction. I'm not here to tell you what your team did wrong, Mr. Vale. I'm here to help you build what's missing. Another long moment. Then Graham opened his laptop. I'll get you the files. He spent the rest of that Saturday in a conference room on the 14th floor with every document Alden Capital's security team had generated in the past 2 years: incident reports, threat assessments, schedule matrices, building access logs, everything. Graham brought him coffee at 3 o'clock and didn't say anything when he brought it, which Elliot took as a reasonable sign of progress. He read everything. He made notes on a legal pad, physical notes, nothing digital, which was habit, and by 5 o'clock he had a picture that was both clearer and more troubling than what he'd had at midnight in his kitchen. The operation had been too well targeted. The specific Friday deposit visit was not on any public record, not in any press release, not in any schedule that left the building's internal systems. Whoever had planned this had either been watching Vivian and Piper long enough to identify the pattern from observation months of it, Patient, careful, or they had access to something internal. A source of information that shouldn't have been accessible from outside. He sat with that for a while. He was not going to tell Graham Vale today that the possibility of an internal leak existed. He didn't have enough yet. You didn't drop that particular piece of information until you had enough to stand behind it. Because if you were wrong, you'd destroyed the professional trust in an entire team for nothing. And if you were right but couldn't prove it, you'd warned the source. He packed his notes into his bag and called Sadie to tell her he'd be home by 6:30, and she told him she'd made a sandwich for dinner and that the jelly-to-bread ratio was perfect, and that she had done it herself, so she knew it was correct. He smiled. He couldn't help it. "Save me half," he said. "I might have eaten some of it already. Sadie, I was hungry. I might have eaten most of it. Save me whatever's left." That might be very little. He pulled his coat on. "I'll pick something up on the way." He took the L home. It was the same route he'd taken yesterday morning, the same Saturday evening train that ran downtown to his neighborhood, with the same mix of tired people heading in various directions, for various reasons, none of them particularly interested in anyone else. He sat near the door and watched the city slide past the windows and thought about a disgraced competitor. A structured acquisition 8 months ago. Months of surveillance. 3 professionals. He thought about Vivian Alden sitting across from him in the coffee shop, with her hands flat on the table and her eyes steady and the roughness in her voice that hadn't quite been filtered out by the night. He thought about Piper asking if she could write him a letter. He thought about Graham Vale's jaw tightening when he said the word counter-surveillance. The train ran through the gray city, and outside the windows, the lights were coming on in buildings and restaurants and apartments where people were having their Saturday evenings, ordinary and unremarkable, and Elliot Mercer sat in his seat with his legal pad of notes in his bag and understood that the quiet life he had built was not going to be as quiet as it had been yesterday morning, and that this was partly his own doing, and that he was not entirely sorry about it. He got off at his stop. He picked up soup from the place on the corner, because Sadie had definitely eaten most of the sandwich. He climbed the stairs to their apartment, and Sadie met him at the door with breadcrumbs on her shirt and the unbothered expression of someone who had done nothing wrong. And he handed her the soup and took off his coat and stood for a moment in the doorway of the apartment that was their life cramped, familiar, with Sadie's drawings still taped to the refrigerator, and his boots always in the wrong place, and the particular smell of a home that was lived in, and something settled in him. Not peace, exactly. Not resolution. Just the particular solidity of knowing where you were standing, even when you weren't sure yet what you were standing toward. He closed the door behind him. The first week inside Alden Capital was an education in how organizations convinced themselves they were safe. Elliot arrived Monday morning at 7:45 before the security team's shift change, before the building filled up, before the day established its rhythms, and people stopped noticing things because the things had become familiar. He had learned a long time ago that the best time to see a place clearly was before anyone had settled into performing their normal version of it. People behaved differently when the audience hadn't arrived yet. Graham Vale met him in the lobby. The handshake this time was offered and accepted, which was progress of a kind. Graham had clearly spent the weekend making his own calculations and arrived at the conclusion that cooperation was more professionally useful than resistance, not warm cooperation. Not enthusiastic cooperation, but the functional kind that got things done. Elliot respected it. It was an honest position. "I've set you up in the conference room on 12, Graham said, leading him toward the elevators. "Full system access as of this morning. Cameras, access logs, the scheduling platform. I'll need to walk the building first." Graham paused slightly. "I can assign someone to alone," Elliot said. "I need to walk it alone." Another of those jaw adjustments. "Then fine. I'll have a key card made." The walk took 2.5 hours. Elliot moved through every floor, every stairwell, every service corridor, every loading dock, every space that wasn't a private office, and several that were. He wasn't looking for anything specific. He was building the map, not the floor plan, which he had already memorized from the documents, but the lived map, the one that accounted for the way people actually moved through a space versus the way the architect intended them to. These were always different, sometimes significantly. He found 4 things in those 2 hours that bothered him, and wrote them on his legal pad in the shorthand he'd used since his Navy days. A service entrance on the building's north side that was logged as alarmed, but whose door seal had been compromised long enough that the alarm wouldn't trip on a slow, careful opening. A camera blind spot on the 9th floor that created a 40-foot corridor with no coverage. A pattern in the access logs, suggesting that one of the building's maintenance contractors had a badge that was being used during off hours in a way that didn't match the contractor's stated work schedule, and the fact that the executive elevator, the one that served floors 12 through 18, where Vivian's office and most of her senior staff were located, could be overridden from the basement mechanical room by someone who knew which panel to access. None of these were catastrophic individually. Together they created a picture of a building that had been secured against obvious threats by people who were good at securing against obvious threats, and had been simultaneously left open in the seams by the kind of slow organizational drift that happened in any system where nothing bad had occurred for long enough that people stopped looking at it carefully. He went back to the conference room on 12 and started reading access logs. Piper Alden's letter arrived on Tuesday. It came through Vivian's assistant in a regular white envelope with his name written on the front in the careful, deliberate handwriting of a child who was concentrating very hard on making each letter correct. He opened it at the conference room table during a break from the access logs. "Dear Elliot," it began. "My mom said it was okay to write to you. She said you might be busy so you don't have to write back, but I wanted to say thank you for what you did. I was really scared, but you made it less scary, which I think is the important part. My mom said, you have a daughter named Sadie, and I was wondering if she likes rabbits because I have a stuffed rabbit named Gerald, and I take him most places. If she likes rabbits, that would be something we have in common, which is a good start. Thank you for being brave. I know you said you were scared too. I believe you, but I also think you were brave. Those can both be true at the same time. My mom says that a lot. Sincerely, Piper Alden. S. I hope your arm feels better." He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket and went back to the access logs. And for the rest of the afternoon, he was slightly less bothered by the fact that the contractor badge anomaly was going to take another day to fully trace. That evening, he read the letter to Sadie, who listened with her crackers in her lap and a very serious expression on her face, and then said, "Does she actually take the rabbit everywhere?" She had it at the bank. Sadie considered this. "Gerald is a good name for a rabbit." "I thought so too. I don't have a stuffed rabbit." "I know. I have a stuffed bear. I'm aware of the bear." "His name is Frank." She ate a cracker. "Does Piper know that? About Frank?" "Not yet." Sadie nodded slowly, with the gravity of someone organizing important information. "You should tell her. When you write back." She ate another cracker. "You are going to write back." It wasn't a question. "Yeah," he said. "I'll write back." The contractor badge anomaly broke open on Wednesday afternoon. The badge belonged to a man named Dennis Hale, who worked for a building services company called Meridian Facilities Management, one of 3 contractors the building used for routine maintenance, HVAC, and cleaning. His badge showed normal use during business hours across the first 3 months of his contract. Starting approximately 9 months ago, the pattern changed, late-night accesses to the 18th floor, which housed Vivian's office and her executive assistant's workspace. Never during business hours. Always between 11 p.m.
and 2 a.m.
Always on nights when the building's regular after-hours security rotation had Marcus Tully on the overnight desk, a detail that Elliot only identified by cross-referencing the access timestamps against the shift schedule spreadsheet, which took the better part of Tuesday and most of Wednesday morning. He brought it to Graham Vale at 3:30. Graham looked at the documentation Elliot laid out on the desk, printed, organized, sourced, and his face went through several things in quick succession. Denial was first. The brief flash of this can't be right that preceded the moment when the evidence became undeniable. Then, something colder, the specific fury of a professional who had been operating with a compromised system without knowing it. Then the controlled stillness of a man deciding what to do with what he now knew. "Marcus Tully has been with us 4 years, Graham said. "I know," he was cleared. "Background check, references full." "I know," Elliot said again. "Background checks tell you who someone was, not who they are now. People's circumstances change." He paused. 9 months ago is when the anomaly started. 9 months ago. around the same time as the Kellner acquisition closed. Graham's head came up. Kellner, the competitor who went into restructuring. The acquisition that Vivian Alden closed 8 months ago. He watched Graham's face. I need to know who Kellner Group's principal stakeholder was. Graham was already reaching for his computer. The name that came up was Roland Strake. Graham found it through the corporate filings that Vivian's legal team had compiled during the acquisition process, a name buried 3 levels down in a chain of holding companies and investment vehicles that had taken a team of lawyers 2 months to fully untangle. Roland Strake had been the primary private financier behind Kellner Group, with a stake large enough that when the acquisition forced Kellner into restructuring, Strake had lost, according to the legal team's estimates, somewhere between $200 and $300 million. He's not a name that made the press, Graham said, reading from his screen. Kellner's CEO took most of the public attention. Strake was a background figure. Background figures are sometimes the ones who stay angry the longest, Elliot said. He asked Graham to pull everything the legal team had on Strake. While Graham made calls, Elliot sat in the conference room and thought about the shape of the operation. A background financier, invisible to the public, losing an amount of money that was not abstract even at that level of wealth, $250 million, was a loss that left marks. Not just financial marks, the kind that became personal. He thought about the bank, the precision of it, the months of surveillance required to identify Vivian's Friday pattern with Piper. The 3 professionals who hadn't touched the cash drawers. The attempt to take both mother and daughter simultaneously. This wasn't someone trying to recover money. This was someone trying to take something that couldn't be bought back: control, dominance, the satisfaction of making the person who had beaten him understand what that victory had cost her. That was a different kind of dangerous. The files on Strake arrived by late afternoon. Elliot read them in the conference room while the building emptied around him, floor by floor, as the workday ended and the cleaning crews arrived, and Chicago outside the windows went from the gray of a winter afternoon to the different gray of a winter evening. Roland Strake, 61. Former investment banker, 15 years in commodities trading before moving into private equity. 3 marriages, 2 of which had ended in legal disputes significant enough to appear in court records. A reputation in financial circles for being an effective but unpleasant business partner, the kind of man who produced results while creating enough friction that people were usually relieved when a deal concluded and they didn't have to work with him anymore. No criminal record, no public controversies beyond a civil lawsuit in 2019 that had been settled out of court under terms that were sealed. Nothing that said this man will hire people to abduct a woman and her 8-year-old daughter. But then, nothing ever did. That was the thing about people who crossed those lines. They looked, on paper, like people who hadn't. Until they had. He was still reading when his phone buzzed. Sadie texting from the tablet. He'd set up for her with a single approved messaging contact, which was him. Did you eat dinner? Frank and I are concerned. He looked at the time, 7:22. He had been in the building for nearly 12 hours. He texted back, heading out now. Don't tell Frank I forgot to eat. 3 seconds later, he already knows. He packed up his notes and his printed files, locked them in the conference room cabinet that Graham had assigned to him, and took the elevator down. He told Vivian on Thursday morning. He asked for 30 minutes with her before her first meeting of the day. Her assistant, a precise, efficient woman named Carol, who had clearly seen enough of Vivian's world to be unsurprisable, gave him 25 and said she'd hold the 8:15 call if needed. Vivian's office was on the 18th floor, corner position, with the kind of view of Chicago that you didn't get unless your organization had been paying for that floor's square footage for long enough that the rent had been renegotiated several times. The office itself was less ostentatious than he'd expected: practical furniture, a desk that was clearly a working desk rather than a statement piece, stacks of documents that had been organized but not hidden, a photo on the bookshelf behind her that he registered as Piper at a younger age and looked away from. She was standing when he came in. She stayed standing while he laid out what he had: the contractor badge, Marcus Tutley, the access pattern to her office floor, the timeline corresponding to the Kellner acquisition closure, Roland Strake. When he finished, the office was quiet for a moment. Vivian walked to the window. She stood with her back to him for a few seconds, looking at the city. He waited. He had learned by now that she was a person who processed things internally and then responded, rather than processing out loud, and that interrupting the internal processing produced worse results than letting it complete. Marcus Tully has been in this building for 4 years, she said finally. Still facing the window. I know. He brought his wife to the Christmas party last year. She's pregnant. They're expecting in March. She was quiet for another moment. He needed money, and someone found that out and used it. That's my read, Elliot said. I don't think he understood what the access was for. I think he was told it was industrial espionage competitive intelligence. Not what it actually was. Does it matter what he thought it was? He considered this. It matters for how you proceed legally. Doesn't matter for the security breach. She turned from the window. Her face had the composed quality he'd come to recognize as her working mode, the thing she put on when she needed to function. The professional structure that let her do what needed to be done without the personal weight of it pulling her off course. He had a version of the same thing. He understood what it cost. Strake, she said. Tell me about him. Elliot laid out what he'd read. The background, the financial loss, the reputation, the civil lawsuit. He was careful to separate what was documented from what was inference, a discipline he'd maintained in the field and brought to every room he'd ever worked in. Because the places where documented fact blurred into inference were the places where people made expensive mistakes. The civil lawsuit, Vivian said when he finished. 2019. Who was the plaintiff? The filings sealed. I couldn't get the name. She was quiet. Her expression had shifted slightly, something he couldn't quite categorize. I can find out, she said. You know something about it. There were rumors when we were in the acquisition process. About Strake. She moved to her desk, sat down. Someone had tried to report him for financial fraud. It didn't go anywhere. The person who reported it withdrew the complaint. She looked at her desk for a moment. People who try to report Roland Strake tend to find the process more costly than they anticipated. Elliot noted this. He has the resources to make complaints expensive. He has the resources to make a lot of things expensive, she said, including what happened at the bank. Yes, she looked at him directly. What do we do with this? You take what I have to Hargrove and to your legal team today. Everything the contractor badge, the access logs, the Strake connection. You let them build it into something that can be prosecuted. He paused. You don't go to Strake. You don't have anyone go to Strake. You don't let anyone in this building know what we've found until after it's in official hands, because there's still a chance Tully isn't the only leak, and you don't want to tip anything. She held his gaze. And you? I keep doing what you hired me to do. I keep looking at your security gaps, and I keep building you a better system. He paused. But the investigation is not my job. My job is to make sure that when someone decides to try this again, and Strake is not the kind of man who accepts a single setback and moves on, they run into something different than what they found last time. She was quiet for a moment. You think he'll try again? I think he spent months planning something that failed at the last possible point. I think that's the kind of failure that a person like him doesn't process well. He kept his voice level. I think you should act as though he will, and I think you should keep acting that way until there's a reason not to. She nodded, slowly, with the weight of someone taking on a fact they would prefer were not true. All right. He called Hargrove that afternoon from the conference room with the door closed and walked her through everything. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he'd come to appreciate about her in their brief experience of each other. She was a person who let information arrive before she responded to it. Strake, she said when he finished. We'd looked at the Kellner connection peripherally. He wasn't on our radar as a principal. He's 3 holding companies down from anything visible. That was intentional. The contractor accessed Dennis Hale's badge. You'll want to pull Hale in separately from Tully. Hale may not know what the access was for. He may just know that someone paid him to lend his badge to a cleaning crew member on specific nights. Elliot paused. Tully's the one who had the motive and the access combination. But Hale is probably the easier case to build from. You have all of this documented, printed, and locked. I can have it to you this afternoon. A pause on her end. Mr. Mercer, this is solid work. It's pattern recognition, he said. It's what the access logs were there for. Most people can't read access logs like this. Most people weren't taught to. She said she'd have someone there by 4 to collect the documentation. Then, how's the arm? Still colorful. Take care of it. She paused. And Mercer. Keep her safe. He looked at the closed door of the conference room, through which he could hear faintly the ordinary sounds of a working building phones, conversations, the elevator chiming on a distant floor. That's the job, he said. He found the last piece on a Friday exactly 1 week after the bank. He had been working through the surveillance footage from the 2 months preceding the bank incident, looking for evidence of external observation vehicles that appeared too regularly near Vivian's building. Individuals who showed up in camera frame more than the statistical probability of the area's foot traffic should allow. It was slow, grinding work, the kind that required you to look at hours of footage without your attention drifting, and it was the kind of work that most people weren't built for. He was built for it. At 11:43 in the morning, he found a silver sedan parked on the street outside Vivian's building on 7 separate occasions across the preceding 6 weeks. Different parking positions each time, always within visual range of the building's main entrance. The plates were different on 4 of the 7 appearances rental plates or swapped plates, professional counter-surveillance technique. But the vehicle's make, model, and a specific dent in the rear passenger panel were consistent across all 7. He tracked the one instance where the plates were legitimate to a rental agreement made through a shell company with a billing address in Delaware. He gave this to Hargrove's team along with the footage timestamps and his analysis. Then he went back to Vivian's office and told her what he'd found. She was on a call when he knocked. She saw his face through the glass, said something brief to whoever she was speaking to, and ended the call. He came in and laid the printed documentation on her desk and watched her read it. 6 weeks, she said, at minimum. That's what's on camera. They may have started earlier using methods that weren't visible to your exterior cameras. She set down the papers. She was doing the thing she did processing internally, composure engaged, the personal weight of it held at a distance while she dealt with the information. But this time, the composure had a seam in it that hadn't been there in quite the same way before. He watched her press her fingertips against the edge of her desk. 6 weeks, she said again. Piper goes with me on Friday mornings. The bank was a Friday. They watched us every week. They watched her. She stopped. He didn't fill the silence. He let it be what it was. After a moment, she looked up. She's been asking about going back to her after-school program. She stopped going after the bank. She said she didn't want to, but I think she stopped because she thought I needed her nearby. Vivian's voice was even. Careful. She's 8 years old, and she was managing my fear instead of dealing with her own. He thought about what he'd said in the coffee shop. Scared doesn't mean you stop. It means you're paying attention. The apple didn't fall far. Tell her to go, he said. Have someone there who knows what they're doing. Not a visible detail, nothing that makes her feel like she's being watched or guarded. Someone in the background who knows the environment. He paused. She shouldn't have to shrink down to manage someone else's situation. Even yours. Vivian looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, not the professional composures, something underneath it, something that was less managed. You seem to know a lot about that. About what? About what it costs to make yourself smaller so the people around you don't have to be afraid. He didn't respond right away. Outside the window, Chicago was gray and moving, the ordinary Friday momentum of the city. I know a little about it, he said finally. She held his gaze for a moment that lasted slightly longer than either of them probably intended. Then she looked back at the documents on her desk. I'll call the program director this afternoon. The following week, Hargrove called him on a Tuesday. Tully confessed this morning, she said. He was approached 11 months ago by an intermediary, a man he knew from a previous job, who told him the access was for competitive intelligence work, highly confidential, nothing illegal. He was paid $8,000 over 3 months. A pause. He found out what it was actually for 2 weeks before the bank incident. He said he tried to find a way to stop it without exposing himself and couldn't work out how, so he did nothing. He did nothing, Elliot said. He did nothing, Hargrove confirmed. He said he convinced himself it wouldn't work, that they would fail. Elliot was quiet for a moment. He thought about what it cost a person to make that calculation and live with it. He had no particular sympathy. A woman and a child had been in danger, partly because of what Tully had done and hadn't done, But he understood the architecture of the decision, the way fear and self-interest and desperate rationalization built a case for inaction that felt from the inside almost reasonable. The intermediary, he said, do you have him? We do. He's connected to two of the three men from the bank through a private contracting network. We're working backward towards Strake's direct involvement now. The shell company chain is being unwound. She paused. It'll take time. These things always take time. But you have enough to keep going. We have enough to keep going. He asked her to keep him updated to the degree she was able to, and she said she would to the degree she was able to, and they understood each other on that. He told Vivian that evening. They had fallen into a habit, not a planned one, not something either of them had discussed or arranged, but a habit the way things become habits when two people are working through the same problem from different angles and find that the end of the day is a natural point to compare what they know. She would still be at her desk at 6 or 6:30, long after most of her staff had gone, and he would stop by on his way out with whatever his day had produced, and she would tell him whatever her day had produced. And they would spend 15 or 20 minutes building the picture a little more completely before he left. This evening she was standing at the window again when he knocked, looking at the city in the way she sometimes did at the end of long days, not looking at anything specific, just letting the view be something other than work for a few minutes. He told her about Tully's confession. She listened without turning from the window. When he finished, she said, he convinced himself it wouldn't work. That's what Hargrove said. And when it almost did work, he what? Went back to convincing himself? People are better at that than you'd think. She turned from the window. Her expression was tired in the specific, honest way that happened at the end of days when she'd stopped managing how she looked. I hired you for 3 weeks, she said. It's been 12 days. I know. She looked at him steadily. I'd like to extend the arrangement. Not just the assessment. I need someone who can build what we've identified as missing. The counter-surveillance capability, the protocol gaps, the team training. She paused. I'd like you to stay. He looked at her for a moment. The office was quiet, the building mostly empty below them, the city outside the window doing its evening thing. I have conditions, he said. Tell me, my schedule is built around Sadie. I leave by 5:30 unless there's an active situation. I don't travel overnight unless there's significant advance notice and I've arranged coverage. The role is security, not visibility. I don't want an office with my name on it. I don't want to be introduced as anything other than a staff consultant. Done, she said. And Graham Vale stays as security director. I'm not here to replace him. I'm here to build what his team doesn't have yet. She nodded. I'd already decided that. He thought about it for another moment. Then, all right. She let out a breath, not dramatically, just the small release of someone who had been holding something tense and had felt it ease slightly. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Training Graham's team is going to be uncomfortable for everybody. The corner of her mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood. He'll manage. He'll complain for the first week. He'll manage, she said again, with the certainty of someone who knew Graham Vale well enough to make that assessment confidently. Elliot picked up his coat. He had 20 minutes before Sadie's after-school pickup window closed. I'll see you Monday. Have a good weekend, Mr. Mercer. Elliot, he said. They'd been through enough by now. She held his gaze for a moment. Vivian, she said. He nodded once and went to pick up his daughter. Strake's arrest came on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the bank. Hargrove called him at 7:51. While he was making Sadie's lunch a turkey sandwich this time, with the peanut butter abandoned due to a policy change, Sadie had announced the previous week and told him in the measured, factual way she told him things that federal investigators had taken Roland Strake into custody at his home in Lake Forest at 6:45 that morning. The charges were extensive: conspiracy to commit kidnapping, financing criminal operations through fraudulent corporate structures, securities fraud uncovered in the unwinding of the shell company chain, which had turned out to contain significantly more than anyone had initially anticipated. The civil lawsuit from 2019, unsealed as part of the evidentiary process, had turned out to involve a former business partner who had attempted to report Strake for financial misconduct and had then experienced 3 years of legal harassment that had cost her nearly everything before. Strake's lawyers had accepted a sealed settlement. It's a strong case, Hargrove said. His people are already trying to negotiate, which usually means they know it's strong. How long before it goes to trial? Year, maybe more. These things take time. But he's not getting out on bail. The kidnapping conspiracy charge put him in a category that the judge wasn't comfortable with. A pause. It's over, Mercer. Not legally over, not for a while. But operationally over. He's done. He stood in his kitchen with the turkey sandwich in front of him and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. It's over. He thought about Piper in the lobby. Her white-knuckled grip on Gerald the rabbit. The half-millimeter nod. Her letter, folded in his coat pocket for a week. Before he'd written back a letter that had taken him 3 drafts to get right, which Sadie had reviewed and approved before he'd sent it. He thought about Vivian standing at the window of her office, fingertips pressed against the edge of her desk, saying 6 weeks in a voice that was holding something very careful and very heavy. He thought about what Hargrove had said on a different phone call, from a different part of this. Keep her safe. Thank you, he said, for all of it. You did most of the work, Hargrove said. I just had the badge. He finished making the sandwich. Sadie appeared from her room in the specific chaos of a child preparing for school, one shoe on, hair half done, backpack open with things threatening to fall out of it. Who was that? She asked. Work, he said. She looked at him. 7 years old, and already she could tell the difference between his ordinary work voice and his something has resolved voice. Good work or bad work? He looked at her half-combed hair, her one shoe. Frank the bear visible at the top of the open backpack, which suggested Sadie had been planning to smuggle him to school again and had not yet accepted that this was a known tactic. Good work, he said. She seemed satisfied with this. She went back to looking for her other shoe. He put her sandwich in the bag. Added the apple she wouldn't eat. Added the crackers she would. Zipped the bag closed. Outside the kitchen window, Chicago was doing what it did in the mornings, waking up, moving, unremarkable and continuous, in the way of cities that had been doing this long enough that they no longer needed to think about it. He had spent 4 years building a quiet life. He had spent the last 6 weeks discovering that quiet was not the same as safe, that safe required attention and work and the willingness to look at uncomfortable things directly, and that the 2 men he'd thought could never coexist, the one who knew how to do what needed doing, and the one who packed lunches and picked up his daughter had been the same man the whole time. He just hadn't let himself see it. Sadie appeared with her other shoe, finally triumphant. Found it, she announced. I see that. It was under Frank. Frank needs to stop hiding shoes. Frank wasn't hiding it, he was keeping it warm. She sat on the floor and put it on with the focused attention she gave to things that mattered. Then she stood up and looked at him. Ready? He picked up her lunch bag and his coat. Ready, he said. The news of Strake's arrest moved through Alden Capital, the way news moved through any organization in fragments, distorted by the time it reached most people, the specific facts blurred by the speed of transmission. By 9:30 that Thursday morning, Elliot could hear the change in the building's ambient sound, the shift in the quality of conversations he passed in hallways, the way people gathered in small clusters near coffee stations and spoke in lower voices than usual. He went to his conference room and closed the door and let the building process it without him. Graham Vale knocked at 10. He came in without waiting for an answer, which was new. In 6 weeks of working together, Graham had always waited. Elliot noted the change and said nothing about it. Graham sat down across from him, not at the angle of a man looking to demonstrate authority, but at the angle of someone who had something to say and wasn't entirely sure how to say it. Hargrove called me this morning, Graham said. I know. She told me about the access logs, the contractor badge, how you found it. He looked at the table for a moment. I've had those logs available to me for 4 years. I never looked at them that way. You were looking for different things. I wasn't looking for that. Elliot waited. I want to know how you did it, Graham said. It came out straightforward, without the professional defensiveness that had wrapped everything he'd said in the first 2 weeks. Just a direct request from a man who had decided that his ego was less important than the answer. The cross-referencing, the specific pattern you were looking for. I want to understand how you built that. Elliot looked at him for a moment. Then he pulled out his legal pad. Close the door, he said. This'll take a while. They spent 2 hours going through it. Graham asked good questions, specific, technically grounded questions that showed he understood the operational context and was building towards something, not just collecting information. By noon, Elliot had revised his assessment of Graham Vale upward by a significant margin. The man was not flexible, and he was not quick to trust, and his organizational instincts were built around structure in ways that sometimes made him miss things happening outside the structure. But he was genuinely competent, and more importantly, he was genuinely committed not to the appearance of doing his job well, but to actually doing it. Those two things were not always the same thing in people who held positions like his. The counter-surveillance training, Graham said at one point. You said 2 weeks ago it'd be uncomfortable for everybody. It will be. Start Monday, Graham said. All 12 of us. Including me, Elliot nodded. Including you. Graham stood up, extended his hand. This time the handshake had the weight of something actual behind it, not professional obligation, not managed cooperation, but the specific weight of two people who had decided they were on the same side. I'll have the team assembled at 7, Graham said. 6:30, Elliot said. Graham's jaw moved. 6:30, he agreed. Piper came to the office for the first time on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks after Strake's arrest. Vivian had a board meeting that ran long, and Piper's after-school program ended at 4, and the timing had worked out or not worked out, depending on perspective, such that Piper arrived at the 14th floor conference room with her backpack and Gerald the rabbit and the particular expression of a child who had been to enough of her mother's workplaces to find them more boring than impressive. She found Elliot instead of Vivian. He was at the conference room table with 2 weeks of updated counter-surveillance protocols spread across it, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and she looked at him with the assessing circuit that he recognized from the lobby, the careful sweep of a face, reading it for information. My mom's in a meeting, she said. She'll be out in 20 minutes. You can wait in here. Piper came in and put her backpack on a chair and sat next to it with Gerald in her lap, and looked at the papers on the table with the polite interest of someone who was curious but had been taught not to touch other people's things without asking. Is that work? She asked. Yes. Is it the kind of work you do to make sure things don't happen again? He looked at her. Yes. She nodded seriously. That's good. She looked at Gerald for a moment, smoothed one of his ears. I still have bad dreams sometimes. My mom says that's normal. She's right, Elliot said. Do you have bad dreams? He considered whether to answer honestly or kindly, and then decided that this particular child had earned honesty. Sometimes. Less than I used to. Does it get better? It gets different, he said. The dreams don't always go away. But they stop being the loudest thing. She thought about this with the focused seriousness she brought to things that mattered to her. What becomes the loudest thing instead? He thought about Sadie's voice on a morning before school, arguing about jelly. He thought about the diner on Friday evenings. He thought about walking home through the Chicago, cold with a small hand in his, talking about things he only partially followed but paid attention to anyway. Whatever you choose to pay attention to, he said. Piper looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into her backpack and pulled out a notebook, the spiral-bound kind with a bright green cover, and opened it to a page near the middle. I've been writing things down, she said. Things people tell me that I want to remember. What kind of things? Things that feel true. She found the page she was looking for. I wrote down what you told me at the bank, about being scared. He waited. She read from her notebook, carefully. Being scared doesn't mean you stop. It means you're paying attention. She looked up. I wrote it down that night after. I didn't want to forget it. He looked at the green notebook and the careful handwriting and the 8-year-old, who had decided that certain things were worth keeping, and felt something move in his chest that he wasn't going to name out loud. That's a good thing to write down, he said. I thought so. She closed the notebook and put it away. Then Sadie said Frank is better than Gerald. He blinked. She said that? In her letter. She said Frank is a bear and bears are objectively superior to rabbits. Piper's expression was the precise expression of a person who disagreed with this assessment and was being diplomatic about it. I told her that Gerald has been to 6 countries, and Frank has probably only been to school. That's a fair point. I know. She looked at Gerald. I told her we should let them meet and decide for themselves. Did she respond to that? She said Frank would definitely win in a foot race, but Gerald would win at sitting still. Piper seemed to consider this a partial victory. I think that's fair. He thought about Sadie in her room, writing letters to a girl she'd never met, constructing a careful diplomatic position on the relative merits of stuffed animals. He thought about what it meant that both of them had found something normal and manageable to negotiate in the space, after something that had been neither. Kids were, he thought, significantly better at this than adults, in certain specific ways. They should meet, he said. Piper looked up. Really? If that's something both of you want, and if your mom's okay with it. Piper's face arranged itself into the particular expression of a child who has just received information she is going to deploy strategically and very soon. I'll talk to her, she said. He talked to Vivian that evening, after Piper had gone home, with her, and the building had emptied again, in the way that had become their habit, the 15 or 20 minutes at the end of the day when they built the picture a little more. Piper mentioned something, Vivian said. She was at her desk with a cup of tea that had gone cold, which happened every evening because she always made tea and never had time to drink it. He had noticed this 2 weeks ago and said nothing about it. She seems to have decided that Sadie is her friend. I think the feeling is mutual. She's been writing letters. Sadie mentioned. He paused. They want to meet. Vivian looked at her cold tea. I was wondering when this would come up. She turned the cup slightly. She doesn't ask to meet a lot of new people. She's careful about it. After the bank, she got more careful. She seems fairly decided about this one. She is. Vivian looked up. She told me this morning that Sadie understood about Gerald, and that understanding about Gerald was important. She paused. I'm not entirely sure what that means, but Piper seems to, and that's usually enough. Saturday, he said. There's a place near Lincoln Park good for kids, not overwhelming. We could keep it short, see how it goes. Vivian considered this. You're not worried about it being. She searched for the word. Complicated, he offered. Complicated, she agreed. He thought about it for a moment. The honest answer was that he hadn't not thought about the complicated part. He was not a person who ignored the complicated parts of things he was, in fact, constitutionally incapable of ignoring complicated parts, which had been useful in his old life and occasionally exhausting in his current one. He had thought about what it meant that he was spending 9 and 10 hours a day in this building, that the 15 minutes at the end of each day had become something he was aware of looking forward to, that Vivian Alden was not in any category of person he had ever expected to find himself in a position of actually knowing, and that he knew her anyway, with the specific detailed knowledge of someone who had watched her navigate fear and grief and professional responsibility and the constant quiet weight of raising a child alone, and had found that she navigated all of it imperfectly and honestly, and without asking anyone to pretend otherwise. Kids meeting each other is not that complicated, he said. The rest of it is. But that part isn't. She looked at him for a moment. The rest of it, she said. Yes. We could not talk about the rest of it. We could, he said. For a while, she picked up her cold tea and looked at it and set it down again. Piper would say that not talking about things is how they get louder. She said something similar to me this afternoon. She's been saying it since she was 6. Something softened in Vivian's expression, not the professional composure. Something underneath and older. Her father was not someone who talked about things. She watched that not work for 3 years and drew her own conclusions. He didn't ask about the father. It wasn't his question to ask. Not tonight, not in this office at the end of a workday. But he filed it in the way he filed things that mattered, carefully, without pressure, in a place where it would be available when the time was right. Saturday, he said. Lincoln Park, noon. Short, easy, no pressure. She looked at him steadily. All right, he picked up his coat. Drink your tea. It's cold, then make new tea. He said it without thinking, the way you said things to people you'd gotten comfortable enough with to skip the polite distance, and only registered that he'd said it when she looked at him with the corner of her mouth doing the thing it did when she was close to something she wasn't going to fully express. Good night, Elliot, she said. Good night, Vivian. Saturday at Lincoln Park was not smooth. He wanted to be clear about that. Sadie was nervous in the car, which she expressed by talking too much about nothing in particular, a nervous habit she'd had since she was 4, and which she was completely unaware of, which he had decided years ago not to mention, because it was one of the things about her that was purely hers, and he didn't want to self-conscious her out of it. She talked about Frank. She talked about a project at school. She talked about whether the pretzel stands near the park would be open in February, which was a legitimate question. Piper was nervous, too, which she expressed by going quiet in a way that Vivian, beside her, seemed to recognize and had prepared for, because she kept the conversation light and didn't try to pull Piper into it, just let her exist next to it until she was ready. They arrived at the same time, more or less, from opposite directions. Elliot and Sadie from the L, Vivian and Piper, from a car that Elliot recognized as having one of Graham's team in the driver's seat, which was a detail he appreciated without commenting on. The girls looked at each other. Sadie had Frank in her coat pocket, ears sticking out, which was technically a schools-only smuggling operation repurposed for weekends. Piper had Gerald under her arm. A silence of approximately 4 seconds, which is a long silence between two children who have been writing each other letters for 3 weeks. Then Piper said, "Is that Frank?" Sadie pulled Frank out of her pocket. "This is Frank." Piper held up Gerald. "This is Gerald." Another 2 seconds. "He's smaller than I thought," Sadie said about Gerald. "He's the right size," Piper said, with the firmness of someone defending a friend. "Frank has very short legs. Bears don't need long legs. Rabbits' ears make up for the size difference." Sadie considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "That's actually fair," she said. And that, apparently, was enough. They started walking, the 4 of them, and the girls fell into something that wasn't quite conversation yet, but was in the direction of it. Negotiating the relative attributes of their respective stuffed animals with the focused intensity of 2 people who had found, to their apparent relief, that they had a shared language. Elliot walked next to Vivian. Neither of them said anything for the first 2 minutes, and it wasn't uncomfortable, which was itself significant. The ability to walk next to someone in silence, without either of you working to fill it, was something that only happened when you'd gotten far enough past the performance of knowing someone and into the actual thing. "Piper didn't sleep well last night," Vivian said eventually. "She was anxious. She didn't say so, but I could tell." So was Sadie. "Did she say so?" "She talked about school projects for 40 minutes at dinner." Vivian smiled. He'd seen the full version of it before, but it still caught him slightly off guard. The way it changed her face not softened it, exactly, but revealed something underneath the composed surface that was less defended. "Piper organizes her stuffed animals when she's anxious. I came in last night, and Gerald and 6 others were arranged by size on her shelf. Does that help? She says it makes things feel controllable." Vivian paused. "I understand that." He thought about the things he did when things felt uncontrollable. The legal pad. The systematic reading of documents. The methodical, sequential process of identifying what was knowable and separating it from what wasn't. Different methods, same basic logic. Ahead of them, Piper was telling Sadie something about Gerald's 6-country history. Sadie was listening with the focused attention she gave to things she found genuinely interesting, which was a good sign. Sadie's attention was not easily kept. "She's going to be all right," Elliot said. Vivian looked at him. "Not a question. She already is, mostly," he said. "She's going to keep being more all right. She has the right instincts, and she uses them." He paused. "She's also got a mother who pays attention to the difference between what she says and what she means. That matters more than people think." Vivian was quiet for a moment. The park was February bare, the trees without leaves, the path clear and cold and wide enough that other people moved past them without crowding. A dog ran ahead of its owner. 2 elderly men sat on a bench arguing about something with the comfortable vehemence of people who had been arguing about the same thing for 40 years. "Can I ask you something?" Vivian said. "Yes, Lauren." She said it carefully, the way you said a name that belonged to someone you'd only heard about, not known. "You've mentioned her twice. Both times you stopped, like you'd said more than you meant to." He thought about this. The honest answer was that Lauren had been so thoroughly woven into the fabric of his interior life for 4 years, not just the grief, but the way grief becomes part of the structure of a person, the way it changes the shape of every room you walk into, that she existed in the space before language, in the part of him that was prior to words. Talking about her required translating her from that place into something speakable, and he was not always sure the translation worked. "She died 4 years ago," he said. "Aneurysm. She was 33. There was no warning she was fine, and then she wasn't." He kept his voice even. Not because he didn't feel it, but because he'd had 4 years to learn how to feel it, without being taken down by it. Sadie was 3. She doesn't have a lot of memories of her. "I'm sorry," Vivian said. Simple without decoration. "Thank you. Do you talk to Sadie about her?" As much as I can. As much as Sadie asks, which is more than you'd expect from a 7-year-old. He watched his daughter ahead of them, now apparently describing Frank's distinguished history with such conviction that Piper was nodding. She asks things I don't always know how to answer. What her mom's laugh sounded like. Whether she would have liked certain foods. Whether she was good at things Sadie's trying to be good at. He paused. I answer what I can, and I tell her I don't know when I don't know. Is that enough? I don't know that either, he said. I hope so. Vivian walked beside him in silence for a moment. Then Piper's father left when she was 5. Not dramatically, there was no single incident, just a long, gradual process of a man discovering that the life he'd chosen and the life he wanted weren't the same. He's in Seattle now. He sees her twice a year. She paused. She doesn't talk about him much. I think she's decided not to organize her feelings about him until she's older and has more vocabulary for it. That sounds like her. It does. Something complicated moved through Vivian's expression. I spent a long time after he left feeling like I'd failed at something. Even though I knew, rationally, that it wasn't that. It was just two people who'd made something real, and then found that real things don't always survive the distance between what people need. She paused. I still feel like I failed sometimes. On the bad days. That's not a failure you caused, he said. I know that. Knowing it and feeling it are different things. She looked at him sideways. You sound like Piper. She's a smart kid. She gets it from somewhere. He glanced at her, and she was looking forward again, at the path ahead, at the girls walking 10 feet in front of them, who were now apparently in agreement about something, the evidence for which was that Sadie was letting Piper hold Frank, which was not something Sadie did easily or often. Something moved in him, looking at the 4 of them, at this specific configuration of people, on this specific path on this cold February Saturday, this arrangement that had not existed 8 weeks ago, and now existed with a solidity that surprised him when he paid attention to it. He was not someone who used words like fate or meant to be, because he had lived long enough and seen enough to know that things happened because of sequences of causes, and not because of intention, and that the stories people told about why things happened were usually constructed after the fact. But he also knew that standing in a bank lobby 8 weeks ago, looking at a little girl in a red jacket who was looking back at him and deciding whether to trust him, he had made a choice. And the choice had led here, the way choices did. Not directly, not neatly, not without cost and complication, and the particular difficulty of two people who had both built very good walls, finding those walls useful and inconvenient in equal measure. But here, can I ask you something, he said? Yes. What do you actually want? He kept his voice the same level, not pressing, just asking. Not for the company. Not for Piper, though obviously for Piper. For yourself. She was quiet for a moment. Ahead of them, the girls had stopped at a pretzel stand and appeared to be conducting a serious negotiation about flavor options. Vivian watched them. I want to stop waking up at 3 in the morning running security assessments in my head, she said. I want to have a dinner that lasts longer than 20 minutes before something requires my attention. I want Piper to stop managing my fear instead of her own. She paused. She stopped. Say it. She looked at him. The composed surface and the thing underneath it, and the work it took to keep them separate, which he sees now because he knew what to look for. I want to stop feeling like moving forward means leaving everything behind. Like the only way to have something new is to let go of everything I've already built. He understood this so precisely, in such specific and personal detail, that for a moment he didn't say anything, because the thing that needed to be said was too large for a quick answer, and he didn't want to give her a quick answer. Moving forward isn't leaving things behind, he said finally. It's carrying the best of them with you. Lauren is part of who I am. Piper's father is part of who you are. The things we've survived are part of who we are. You don't leave those to go somewhere new. He paused. You take them, and you see where they fit in the new place. She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of long moment where a person was deciding something, not impulsively, but with the weight of someone who made decisions seriously and lived with them fully. Then she looked forward. The pretzel stand is open, she said. I see that. Piper is going to want the cinnamon sugar one. What do you want? She thought about this with more seriousness than the question technically required. The salted one, she said, if you're buying. He looked at her. The corner of her mouth. The almost smile. I'm buying, he said. The months after that were not a straight line. He wanted to be honest about that, the way he tried to be honest about all of it. Because the story of how two people found their way toward each other was never a straight line when it involved two people who were both carrying things and had both spent years being cautious with them. There were weeks when the work was overwhelming and the available space for anything personal contracted to nearly nothing. There were evenings when he drove home tired and uncertain, running the calculus of whether what he was building inside that building was sustainable, or whether he was making promises to himself that the reality of the job would eventually contradict. There were conversations with Sadie that were harder than he'd expected. She was 7 going on 8, and she was perceptive in the specific way of children who had grown up watching one parent very closely, and she noticed things. She noticed that he stayed later some evenings. She noticed that he talked about Vivian in a different register than he talked about Graham or Hargrove or anyone else from work. She noticed because she was Sadie, and she filed what she noticed with the careful organizational system that was entirely her own. In April, 6 weeks after the Lincoln Park Saturday, she asked him directly. They were at the diner. Pancakes, as always. She was halfway through hers when she set down her fork with the deliberateness of someone who had been preparing to say something and had decided the time was right. "Do you like Vivian?" she asked. He didn't pretend not to understand the question. She would have found that insulting. "Yes," he said. Like how? He thought about how to answer this in a way that was honest and also appropriately scaled to a 7-year-old's version of the question. "I think she's a good person," he said. "I think she's smart and she works hard and she loves Piper very much. And I think I like spending time with her. In a way, I haven't liked spending time with anyone in a long time." Sadie processed this. "Ate a piece of pancake. Does she like you?" "I think so. Does Piper know?" "I think Piper has had a theory for a while." Sadie nodded slowly, with the expression of someone who has been sitting on their own theory and has just had it confirmed by the evidence. "Frank likes Gerald," she said. "I wasn't sure at first, but I think he does." He looked at her. "Is that relevant?" "I think if Frank likes Gerald, it means things are probably okay," she said with absolute seriousness. He tried very hard not to smile. He was not entirely successful. "That's your criteria?" "Frank has good instincts." She went back to her pancakes. "You should tell her," she added without looking up. "Before it gets more complicated." He looked at his daughter. 7 years old, with syrup on her chin and complete confidence in the strategic wisdom of a stuffed bear, giving him relationship advice at a diner table. "Okay," he said. "And Dad?" She looked up. Her expression was the same one she used when she was about to say something she'd been thinking about for a long time and wanted to get exactly right. "Mom would be okay with it. I think she would want you to be okay with it, too." The diner was warm and full of ordinary noise around them, and outside the window, Chicago was moving through spring, and he looked at his daughter and felt something that was grief and gratitude and love all at once, inseparable from each other, the way they'd been for 4 years, the way they'd probably be for a long time yet. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome." She went back to her pancakes. More syrup. He passed the syrup. He told Vivian in May not with a speech. He was not a speech person, and she wasn't a speech person, and anything that resembled a formal declaration would have sat wrong with both of them, too neat, too performed, too unlike the way they'd actually gotten to know each other, which was messily and gradually, and in 15-minute increments at the end of long workdays. He told her on the building's 14th floor, at the end of a Thursday, when the tea was cold again, and the city was doing its evening thing outside the window, and she was looking at a report she'd already read 3 times because she was tired and her eyes kept sliding off the words. "Put the report down," he said. She looked up. "I need to tell you something, and I'd rather tell you when you're actually paying attention." She set down the report. She looked at him with the full, clear attention she gave to things she was taking seriously, and he was briefly aware of how rarely he'd had someone's full, clear attention in the past 4 years, and how different it felt from being looked at. "I'm not going to make this into something large," he said. "It's actually simple. I want to see where this goes. Whatever this is. I'm not asking for anything specific. I'm just telling you that I'd like to, if you would." She was quiet for a moment. The room was very still. "I've been waiting for you to say something since February," she said. He blinked. "February. Lincoln Park. You bought the pretzel. She looked at him with the corner of her mouth doing its thing. I was fairly clear. You were subtle. I was very clear. He thought about the walk, the cold park, the pretzel stand, the way she'd looked at him when he said, I'm buying. I'm not always good at reading subtle, he said. I know. She said it without exasperation, just as a fact. I've noticed that about you. You're very good at reading rooms and very bad at reading people who are trying not to show you something. She paused. I'll try to be less subtle. I'd appreciate that. She stood up from her desk, walked to the window and stood there for a moment looking at the city, and then turned and looked at him. I'm scared, she said. I want you to know that. I'm not going to pretend I'm not. I know. I'm going to be bad at certain things. I'm very good at working and very out of practice at the rest of it. I haven't done it in 4 years, he said. We can be bad at it together. She looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed, not the polished professional version of Vivian Alden that managed rooms and ran organizations, but an actual laugh, the kind that surprised her, the kind that came from somewhere below the composed surface and arrived without permission. That's a terrible pitch, she said. I told you I was going to keep it simple. We can be bad at it together is not simple. It's bleak. It's honest. She shook her head, but she was still smiling, the full version, the one that changed her face. All right, she said. Honest works for me. 1 year after the bank, they went back. Not planned or not entirely planned. Elliot drove downtown on a Saturday in February, Sadie in the back seat, explaining something about a school project on ecosystems, and he took a specific route that he'd been thinking about taking for a few weeks, and when the building came into view, he pulled over. He'd told Vivian the night before. She'd been quiet for a moment and then said she'd meet them there. They arrived within minutes of each other, Elliot and Sadie from one direction, Vivian and Piper from another. The plaza in front of the First Continental branch was exactly what it had always been, a rectangle of downtown Chicago real estate with a few benches, a pretzel stand that appeared to operate regardless of weather, and the ordinary human traffic of a Saturday morning. Nothing happened. People walked past. A bus moved down the street. 2 pigeons disputed jurisdiction over a dropped piece of something near the bench. Piper stood beside Elliot and looked at the building's glass front, and he could see her taking it in the lobby, the teller windows visible from outside, the marble floor. He didn't say anything. He let her look. After a moment she said, It just looks like a bank. It is just a bank, he said. It didn't feel like that. No, it didn't. She was quiet for another moment. Then she looked up at him. She was 9 now, and something in her had settled in the past year, not the quickness, not the careful attention, but some of the wariness that had come after the bank had eased, the way wariness did when enough safe days accumulated against it. Do you still think about it? She asked. Sometimes. Does it still feel big? He thought about how to answer this in a way that was true. It feels like something that happened, he said, not bigger than it was, not smaller. Just the size it actually was. She nodded slowly. I think I'm getting there, she said. You are, he said. You've been getting there for a while. You just can't always see it while it's happening. Sadie appeared from where she'd been investigating the pretzel stand with the focused attention of someone making an important purchasing decision. The cinnamon sugar ones are back, she reported to Piper. I checked. They had them all winter, but the guy told me they almost ran out in December, which was almost a crisis. Piper's expression suggested she understood the weight of this information. We should get them before they run out again. That's what I said. They looked at Elliot and Vivian with the unified front of children who have reached a consensus and are presenting it to the relevant adults. Vivian looked at Elliot. He looked at the building one more time. The glass front, the marble floor visible inside. The ordinary lobby of an ordinary bank on an ordinary Chicago Saturday, containing nothing more dangerous than teller lines and deposit slips, and 2 pigeons who had relocated their dispute to the sidewalk. He thought about Sadie's voice at the diner. Mom would be okay with it. I think she would want you to be okay with it, too. He thought about Piper's green notebook, things that feel true. He thought about a specific Friday morning, 8 weeks after Lauren died, when he'd stood in Sadie's doorway and understood that the only way through was to make the next meal, do the next task. Take the next step, not because it would feel meaningful, but because meaning was something you found on the way, not something you started with. He had spent 4 years believing that the two things he was the man who could do what needed doing in rooms like the one behind that glass, and the man who packed lunches and picked up his daughter and wanted only the ordinary machinery of a quiet life could not exist in the same body. He had believed it was necessary to choose, that the cost of being useful to the world outside was always paid by the world inside, and vice versa. He understood now that this was wrong, not because both things had turned out to be easy, or compatible, or without friction. They were not. The job was still demanding in ways that required constant negotiation with the rest of his life. Sadie still needed things that sometimes collided with what work required. Vivian was still learning to let someone else manage things she had been managing alone for years, and he was still learning to say the true thing instead of the safer version of it. And both of those things were ongoing projects without clean resolution. But they were the same road, protecting the people he loved and allowing himself to love again. Being the man who showed up when something needed doing, and the man who made the next meal and took the next step. Being present for Sadie and being something more than a function. Carrying Lauren with him and walking toward something new. None of these had required him to abandon the others. They had, as it turned out, required each other. He had just needed enough safe days to see it. Vivian was looking at him. The composed surface and the thing underneath it, and after 8 months of being in the same rooms with her, he knew both of them well enough that he no longer needed to read one to find the other. Pretzels, she said. Pretzels, he agreed. He bought them 1 for each of them. Sadie's with extra salt because she had asked, and Piper's cinnamon sugar because she had a point about it being the superior choice and had made that point with enough conviction that he'd stopped arguing it in November. They stood in the plaza and ate their pretzels. The city moved around them in the ordinary way of cities on Saturday mornings, purposeful and indifferent, full of people going in their own directions with their own reasons, none of them paying any attention to the 4 people standing near a bank's glass front in the February cold. Sadie finished her pretzel and immediately started on Piper's, which Piper allowed on the grounds that Sadie had let her hold Frank earlier, and they had an existing agreement about exchanges of this kind. Vivian finished hers and stood quietly next to him, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, which was a thing that had happened gradually over months and now happened without either of them deciding it. Her hand found his. Not a gesture, not a statement. Just her hand in his, the way things happened when they had stopped needing to be announced. He held it. Around them, Chicago went about its Saturday. 2 little girls argued about the last bite of a pretzel with the passionate investment of people who had decided that this specific pretzel was important enough to matter. A bus moved down the street. The pigeons came back. The glass front of the bank reflected the February sky and the people walking past and the 4 of them standing there, ordinary and unremarkable in every way that was important. He had wanted an invisible life. He had won, in all the ways that counted a life, where nobody looked at him twice on a sidewalk, where he drove a car with a dent in the back panel and packed lunches with sometimes too much jelly, where the security system he'd built at Alden Capital worked precisely because it was designed to be invisible, present everywhere, and visible nowhere. But invisible was not the same as alone. He had not understood that 4 years ago, when he came home and stood in the doorway of a too-quiet apartment with a 3-year-old daughter who needed a father and a grief that sat in every room. He had understood that he needed to be present, and he had been present, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. But he had also, in his discipline and his love and his specific kind of stubborn care, built walls thick enough that presence had become the whole of it, that he had filled every available space with Sadie and work, and the machinery of a life carefully operated, and had left no room for the things that couldn't be scheduled or controlled or assessed for risk. The things that arrived instead, on an ordinary Friday morning, in the wrong bank, at the wrong time, or the right time. He thought that was probably a matter of perspective. Piper won the pretzel argument by virtue of having started with the cinnamon sugar one and being able to make a strong case for prior ownership. Sadie accepted this ruling with the grace of someone who had also been eating most of it anyway. They declared the matter resolved and immediately started talking about something else, with the complete topic abandonment that was a specific talent of children who had decided something was over. He stood in the plaza with Vivian's hand in his and his daughter nearby, and the city going about its February, and thought about Lauren. The way he always thought about her when something real happened, not with grief as the primary note anymore, but with the complicated mix of grief and love and time that 4 years had made into something he could carry without being crushed by it. He thought about what she would have made of this specific Saturday. He thought that she would have had opinions about the pretzel stand. He thought she would have been, in whatever way was hers, okay with this. He was okay with it. Sadie came over and took his other hand, the way she did when she wanted contact without making it a thing. The 7 now almost 8-year-old version of reaching for someone. And he held that hand too, and stood in the February city with both of them, and the afternoon light was the flat winter gray that promised nothing specific and nothing threatening. The same light it had been a year ago, the same city, the same him. Just more of what he was, which was in the end all moving forward ever really was. Not leaving what had been behind, carrying it forward. Into the next meal, the next step, the next ordinary and unremarkable and completely sufficient day.